The grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the rustle of designer gowns. The city's elite had gathered, each flaunting wealth and beauty like armor. In the midst of it all, Edward Langston, a self-made millionaire, straightened his tie nervously. But it was not the stock market or business rivals that made him uneasy tonight. It was the simple fact of introducing his wife. Clara, she was kind, loyal, and the heart of his life. Yet Edward often saw her through society's cruel lens, plain, modest, and not dazzling enough for the glamorous world he inhabited. As Clara entered the room, whispers flickered like sparks. Edward flushed with embarrassment, wishing he had come alone. But then, something unexpected happened. Clara smiled, moved gracefully through the crowd, and with a quiet confidence, began to shine in a way that no jewel, no gown, and no fortune could rival. By the end of the night, the woman he had once underestimated would become the very soul of the evening, and Edward would never see her the same way again. Edward Langston had spent his life chasing perfection, or rather, the kind of perfection that the world applauded. He was the son of a factory worker, raised in a neighborhood where rusted iron gates creaked open to narrow streets lined with laundry drying in the sun. From those early days, he had promised himself he would climb, one rung at a time, to the very summit of society's ladder. And he had succeeded. By the age of 42, Edward was a millionaire with a flourishing real estate empire. A name spoken with admiration in the city's most exclusive boardrooms, and a place secured among the men and women who shaped the city's future with the stroke of a pen. Yet, for all his polish, his tailored suits, his chauffeured cars, his practiced charm, there remained one part of his life he guarded with a conflicted heart. His wife, Clara. Clara was, by every measure Edward's world held dear, an ordinary woman. She had grown up far from the city's glittering skyline, in a small town where families lived in weather-beaten houses and evenings were filled not with the glow of chandeliers, but with the soft hum of crickets. She had no inheritance, no surname recognized by the old families, no reputation to precede her. Instead, she carried something else, a quiet warmth, a disarming sincerity, and an ability to listen in a way that made people feel both seen and valued. When Edward met her years ago, it was in the most unassuming of places. He had gone back to his hometown briefly, attending a modest community gathering. Clara had been there, helping to serve tea and arrange chairs with a smile that made even the most mundane of tasks seem meaningful. She did not know who he was, at least, not the man the city worshipped. To her, he was just Edward, the boy who once lived down the road, who had left to chase dreams in the city. That very simplicity, that unaffected kindness, had drawn him in. Love had come softly but steadily. He was captivated not by glamour but by her authenticity, not by grand gestures but by her gentleness. He married her, despite raised eyebrows from acquaintances who whispered that she did not fit the mold of a tycoon's wife. Edward had told himself he did not care. What mattered was that she understood him, not his wealth. But as the years passed and his empire expanded, Edward began to feel the weight of those whispers more keenly. Every business dinner, every social gathering, every gala served as a mirror reflecting back society's unspoken expectations. The powerful men arrived with women who dazzled, their presence a continuation of their husbands' reputations. Clara, with her modest dresses and shy smile, never played that role. It was not that she lacked beauty. In her own way, she was striking. With soft brown eyes that seemed to see into one's very soul, and hair that gleamed like chestnut silk when the sunlight caught it. But she did not parade herself. She preferred quiet colors to bold ones, handmade dresses to designer gowns, meaningful conversation to gossip. To the society Edward now occupied, this made her invisible. And to Edward's shame, her invisibility sometimes embarrassed him. He loved her, there was no question about that. He admired the way she treated his employees with kindness, the way she remembered the names of the chauffeurs and secretaries that his peers often ignored, the way she laughed without pretense. Yet, when he stood among men whose wives glittered in gowns that cost more than some people earned in a year, Edward felt a knot in his stomach. He worried how others judged her. Worse still, he worried how they judged him for choosing her. The test of this inner conflict arrived one spring when Edward received the gilded invitation to the Langston Foundation Gala. Though the gala bore his name, it was more than just another evening of charity. It was a spectacle, a convergence of power brokers, dignitaries, and celebrities, an arena where reputations were cemented and alliances forged. For Edward, it was the crown jewel of his year. An opportunity not only to showcase his philanthropic endeavors but also to stand shoulder to shoulder with the city's most influential figures. There was, however, an unspoken rule: appearances mattered as much as contributions. Men were judged by the refinement of their suits, women by the elegance of their gowns, and couples by the harmony of their presentation. In that world, a wife was not merely a companion. She was a statement, a symbol of taste and status. And this was where Edward's heart wrestled with itself. He wanted Clara by his side. She was, after all, his wife, his partner. The woman who had stood with him before fortune had favored his name. But he also feared what would follow if she appeared among the glittering crowd. He imagined the whispers, the sidelong glances, the mocking laughter disguised as polite conversation. For days leading up to the gala, Edward found himself strangely restless. In meetings, his mind wandered. At home, he caught himself watching Clara as she moved about the house, humming softly while she prepared their meals, or sitting by the window with a book in her hands. She was content in her simplicity, and he wondered bitterly why that contentment unnerved him. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the city skyline, Edward broached the subject gently. "The gala is next week," he said, his tone casual, though his chest tightened with each word. Clara looked up from her book, her eyes lighting with warmth. "Yes, I saw the invitation on your desk. It sounds like a beautiful event." He hesitated. "It is important. Very important." She tilted her head, sensing his unease. "Do you want me to come with you?" The question, innocent and sincere, pierced him. He wanted to say yes without hesitation, to assure her that her presence was not only desired but essential. But the ghost of his pride held him back. He forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, Clara, you are my wife. It would not feel right without you." That night, Clara laid out her modest ivory gown, the one she had sewn herself years ago and worn only once. She smoothed the fabric lovingly, her heart lifting at the thought of accompanying her husband. To her, the gala was not about wealth or appearances but about standing beside Edward, sharing in his success, being his partner as she always had been. Edward, however, sat alone in his study long after she had gone to bed. The invitation lay on the desk before him, the embossed letters shimmering under the lamplight. He stared at it as though it were a verdict. He loved Clara, but he could not silence the fear that bringing her into that world would expose him, not her, as a man whose life, for all its grandeur, was not as polished as it seemed. And so, with the ticking clock counting down to the gala, the conflict within Edward Langston deepened, a battle between love and pride, between authenticity and appearances, between the woman he adored and the image he worshipped. Little did he know, the decision to bring her to the gala would not only test his heart but alter his life forever. The night of the gala arrived with all the grandeur of a coronation. The city glowed beneath the spring moon, its skyscrapers shimmering like blades of glass against the heavens. Luxury cars rolled smoothly along the boulevard leading to the Langston Foundation Hall, their polished exteriors gleaming beneath the camera flashes of waiting photographers. For weeks, newspapers and society magazines had buzzed about the event, declaring it the highlight of the season. A gathering of power and elegance. Edward Langston sat stiffly in the back of his limousine, the soft hum of the engine drowned out by the storm of unease pounding in his chest. He adjusted his cufflinks for the fourth time, the platinum edges catching the faint light. He had dressed impeccably in a black tuxedo tailored in London, every detail immaculate. Outwardly, he looked every bit the titan of industry. Inwardly, he felt like a man walking toward judgment. Beside him sat Clara, her posture serene, her eyes wide with a quiet curiosity, as she gazed out at the sea of lights. She wore the ivory gown she had carefully pressed the night before, its simplicity graceful against her figure. Around her neck hung her mother's pendant, a modest silver locket that glowed faintly in the car's dim interior. She had pinned her chestnut hair into a soft updo, leaving a few curls to frame her gentle face. "Do you think I look all right, Edward?" she asked, her tone calm but hopeful. She was not seeking validation from the world, only from the man beside her. Edward's throat tightened. He forced a smile, though his stomach churned with dread. "You look lovely, Clara." She smiled, satisfied with his answer, and turned back to the window. For her, the night was a chance to share in Edward's success, to stand beside him proudly. For Edward, it felt like walking a tightrope. Between pride and humiliation, the limousine eased to a stop before the grand entrance of the hall. A red carpet stretched across the marble steps like a river of fire. Paparazzi crowded the edges, their lenses glinting like watchful eyes. Guests stepped out of sleek vehicles one by one, each arrival an exhibition, men in their finest suits. Women draped in glittering gowns that cascaded like liquid jewels. When the chauffeur opened their door, Edward stepped out first, his practiced smile in place. Flashes erupted instantly, the crowd murmuring his name. Then Clara emerged. For a brief moment, silence seemed to ripple through the camera's clicking frenzy. She was no diamond-draped socialite, no dazzling heiress. She looked like what she was, a woman of modest beauty and quiet dignity. A few photographers snapped half-heartedly before turning their lenses elsewhere. Edward caught the subtle lift of eyebrows from nearby guests, the small, knowing smirks. His chest tightened. He placed his hand lightly at Clara's back, guiding her inside as though speed might shield her from the weight of those stairs. Inside, the ballroom was a cathedral of opulence. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen rain, casting prisms of light across gilded walls. Tables adorned with white roses and gold-rimmed china filled the hall, while a string quartet played melodies that floated like silk through the air. The scent of roses, perfume, and aged wine mingled into a heady fragrance the moment Edward and Clara entered. Heads turned. Some greeted Edward with enthusiasm, clapping him on the shoulder and offering firm handshakes. But when their eyes flickered toward Clara, the warmth dimmed into polite restraint. She was acknowledged, yes, but with the cool detachment of formality. "Edward, good to see you," boomed Richard Stanton, one of Edward's longtime business associates, his diamond-studded watch glinting. His wife, Veronica, stood at his side, her gown shimmering with sequins. Her eyes swept over Clara in a single glance, her painted lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "And this must be Clara," Veronica said sweetly. "How refreshing to see someone who doesn't follow the trends." Clara, missing the subtle edge in her tone, smiled warmly. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Stanton. Your gown is beautiful." Veronica blinked, her composure faltering at the genuine compliment. Richard chuckled awkwardly, and the couple excused themselves quickly, leaving Edward with a burning flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. Throughout the evening, it was the same story. Men welcomed Edward. Their wives glanced at Clara with barely concealed curiosity, then shifted conversations toward safer ground. Clara, unbothered, continued to offer kind words, asking after their children or praising the decor. But Edward could feel the gulf widening between his world and hers. Every sideways glance was a knife, every hushed murmur an echo of the fear that haunted him. She does not belong here. And they all know it. As the evening progressed, Edward's discomfort grew. At one point, while he was engaged in a conversation about an upcoming merger, he overheard a sharp whisper from two women nearby. "She stitched her own gown, I heard. Can you imagine? At a gala like this." Well, Edward has always been unconventional. But really, it seems careless for a man of his stature. The women giggled softly, covering their mouths behind jeweled fingers. Edward's ears burned with shame. He glanced toward Clara, who was standing near a display of artwork set for auction. She leaned close to a painting, studying it with an expression of wonder, as though it were more important than the glittering room around her. She did not hear the remarks, but Edward did. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to storm over and silence the whispers. Later, during dinner, Clara found herself seated between Edward and an elderly philanthropist named Mrs. Harrington. Unlike the others, Mrs. Harrington did not dismiss her. Instead, she asked Clara about her hometown. And Clara's eyes lit with enthusiasm as she spoke of childhood summers, of baking bread with her mother, of community festivals where music and laughter filled the streets. Mrs. Harrington listened intently, smiling. "You have a gift, my dear," she said softly. "You make the ordinary sound extraordinary." Edward overheard and shifted uncomfortably. A part of him wanted to beam with pride at the compliment, but another part twisted with unease. He wondered if others at the table thought Clara was charming, or if they pitied him for having a wife so unpolisher. As the string quartet played softly in the background, Edward raised his glass to his lips, his hand trembling slightly. He had never felt more conflicted. Clara was radiant in her own way, her smile brighter than the chandeliers above. Yet in this room, surrounded by artifice and grandeur, he felt as though she were a candle among floodlights, warm, beautiful, but outshone. The night wore on, the tension coiling tighter with each passing hour. Edward longed for the event to end, to retreat to the privacy of their home where no one's judgment mattered. But fate had other plans. The evening was far from over, and Clara's quiet presence was about to challenge everything he thought he knew about status, pride, and true worth. The Langston Foundation Gala was designed to impress, but by the midpoint of the evening, the splendor began to feel heavy. The chandeliers still sparkled above, and the quartet continued to play their practiced melodies, yet an invisible chill had crept into the atmosphere. The conversations, though plentiful, carried a rehearsed quality, like lines read from a script. Guests laughed at the right moments, clinked glasses when expected. But behind the polished surfaces lay boredom. Edward Langston sat at the head table, Clara beside him, forcing himself to maintain the mask of ease. Inside, his nerves buzzed. He had spent the evening torn between pride in his wife's composure and dread of how others saw her. Clara had handled herself with grace, never faltering under the subtle coldness of the other wives. But Edward could not shake the feeling that each polite smile she received was edged with condescension. Then, as dinner plates were cleared and murmurs settled into a lull, the host of the evening, a charismatic philanthropist named Charles Whitmore, took the stage. He tapped the microphone gently, drawing the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming with warmth, "tonight we gather not only to celebrate the extraordinary generosity of this community, but also to remember why we are here to give. To give not just with our purses, but with our hearts." The audience responded with polite applause. Charles smiled, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "In the spirit of generosity, we will do something a little different this year. Instead of simply speeches from our board, I would like to invite any of our esteemed guests to share a personal reflection, something about giving, about kindness, or about what community means to you. It does not have to be grand. It only has to be honest." A ripple went through the crowd. The wealthy were rarely asked to bare their hearts in public. A few brave souls. Rosa Senator gave a brief, predictable remark about public service. A fashion magnate spoke about donating profits to education. The audience clapped politely, but the words carried no spark. They were rehearsed, polished, hollow. Charles looked around expectantly. Who else will share? The room went quiet. Guests glanced at one another, then down at their glasses. The silence stretched, awkward and thick, and then, without warning, Clara rose to her feet. Edward's heart lurched. He gripped the edge of the table, his pulse hammering. What is she doing? His first instinct was to stop her, to gently tug her arm and whisper that this was not her place. But before he could move, Clara had already begun her walk toward the stage. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who is that? Langston's wife. What on earth could she possibly say? Edward sat frozen, his face hot, his mind torn between dread and disbelief. Clara ascended the steps with quiet poise, her ivory gown trailing softly behind her. She took the microphone in hands that did not tremble, her gaze sweeping across the glittering crowd. For a moment, she simply stood there, her expression calm, her presence unassuming yet undeniable. When I was a little girl, Clara began, her voice soft but clear. I lived in a small town where wealth was measured not in dollars but in kindness. The room, expecting nerves or awkwardness, stilled. Her words, though simple, carried a warmth that drew attention. My mother was a widow, Clara continued, and there were many times when we had very little. Yet I remember, whenever we lacked food, neighbors would appear at our door with baskets of bread and fruit. When our roof leaked, the men from down the road came with hammers and nails. And when our spirits sank, the women sang together in the evenings, so the whole town would feel less alone. A hush spread across the ballroom. Even the quartet, sensing the moment, lowered their instruments. Clara touched the silver locket around her neck. This pendant belonged to my mother. She wore it every day, though it was worth almost nothing. She used to tell me, true wealth is what you give, even when you think you have nothing left. Her voice grew steadier, infused with quiet conviction. Tonight, as I look around this beautiful room, I see so much power, so much influence, so much wealth. And I cannot help but wonder, what if we gave not just what was easy, but what was hard? What if giving was not about reputation or recognition, but about the unseen, the unrecorded, the moments when no one is watching? A murmur stirred among the guests, not of dismissal, but of thought. Eyes turned inward, faces softened. Clara smiled gently. I am not a businesswoman. I do not sit on boards. I do not have fortunes to give away. But I do know what it is to receive kindness, and I know the difference it can make. And that, I believe, is why we are all truly here tonight. Not to outshine one another, but to remind ourselves that our humanity is measured by how we care for others. She ended simply, "Thank you." For a long, breathless moment, there was silence. Then, the room erupted, not in polite applause, but in thunderous clapping, cheers, even a few tears. People rose to their feet, their earlier reserve shattered by the authenticity of her words. Edward sat in stunned silence, his heart swelling with emotions he could not name. He had feared embarrassment. Instead, Clara had stolen the show. She had captivated the most hardened of hearts, turning a night of shallow spectacle into something real. As Clara returned to their table, people leaned toward her with genuine admiration. "Beautifully said," murmured the senator. "Remarkable," whispered Veronica Stanton, her earlier condescension erased. Even Charles Whitmore clasped Clara's hand as she stepped down. "You have reminded us all of the true meaning of this evening," he said warmly. Edward stood as Clara approached, unable to sit. For the first time in years, he looked at her not through the eyes of society, but through the eyes of truth. She was luminous not because of jewels or gowns, but because of the fire within her. And then, as though the night had not already been transformed, the band began to play a waltz. The host encouraged couples to take the floor. Guests turned toward Edward expectantly, waiting for the host of the evening to lead the way. Edward hesitated, still reeling from the weight of his revelation. Then Clara smiled at him, extending her hand with quiet confidence. "Dance with me, Edward," she said softly. He took her hand, leading her onto the polished floor. The crowd watched as they began to move in rhythm with the music. At first, Edward's steps were stiff, his nerves still raw. But as Clara's gentle touch guided him, his tension melted. She moved gracefully, her gowns swirling softly with each turn, her face radiant under the chandeliers. And then Edward realized every eye in the room was on her. Not in ridicule, but in admiration. The woman he had once worried would diminish him was instead elevating him, drawing light to him simply by being who she was. By the end of the dance, applause filled the hall once more. The guests had seen something genuine, something rare, a woman who needed no diamonds to shine, and a man fortunate enough to walk beside her. Edward bowed his head toward Clara, his chest aching with pride and regret all at once. He had never been prouder of her. He had never felt smaller for doubting her. And as the music faded, Edward knew his life had changed. The applause from the dance still echoed in Edward's ears long after the music had faded. He and Clara had returned to their table, but nothing about the evening felt the same. The room that once seemed filled with judgmental eyes now glowed with admiration. Wherever Clara walked, heads turned not with pity, not with ridicule, but with awe. People leaned toward her in conversation, seeking her warmth, laughing with genuine delight at her words. Edward sat silently at her side, his heart swelling with conflicting emotions. All night, he had dreaded this moment. He had feared whispers, humiliation, a stain upon his carefully cultivated image. And yet Clara, his humble, unassuming wife, had turned the gala into something no amount of wealth could have purchased. He studied her as she spoke, animatedly with Mrs. Harrington, the elderly philanthropist who had taken such a liking to her. Clara's eyes shone with sincerity, her smile bright and effortless. There was no artifice, no mask. She was the same woman she had always been, gentle, kind, unaffected by the grandeur around her. But tonight, under the chandeliers and the watchful eyes of the city's elite, that very authenticity had become her crown. Edward felt a pang of shame deep in his chest. For years, he had loved her privately, yet kept part of his heart locked away, guarding it against the world's scrutiny. He had admired her, but rarely celebrated her openly. He had let the poisonous whispers of others seep into his pride, convincing him she was somehow not enough. And yet, in a single evening, Clara had proven herself greater than all of them. He replayed the night in his mind, her soft yet powerful words on stage, her graceful steps on the dance floor, the way she had transformed a sterile, glittering event into something meaningful. Clara had not just held her own, she had shone so brightly that everyone else seemed dim beside her. A voice broke into his thoughts. "Edward," said Richard Stanton, his old associate, who approached with his jeweled wife still in tow. For the first time in memory, Richard's tone carried no arrogance, no mockery, only sincerity. You are a fortunate man. Your wife is extraordinary. Veronica, who earlier had dismissed Clara with veiled disdain, now smiled warmly. She has such grace. We are all humbled by her presence tonight. Edward managed a stiff nod, murmuring thanks, though his mind reeled. These were the very people whose judgment he had feared, the people whose approval he thought hinged on appearances. And yet, it was Clara, in her simple gown and silver locket, who had silenced their doubts and commanded their respect. As the night wound on, Edward found himself walking beside Clara more proudly than he had in years. He no longer felt the urge to shield her from stares. He wanted those stares. He wanted the world to see her as he now saw her, with reverence, with wonder, with the realization that she was far more than he had ever given her credit for, but admiration from others, though sweet, was not what haunted Edward most. It was the guilt, the gnawing awareness that his love had been tainted by pride, that he had failed to honor Clara as she deserved. Later, as the gala ended and guests began to depart, Edward guided Clara toward the exit. Photographers still lingered outside, their cameras flashing as the couple emerged into the night. For once, Edward did not flinch. He held Clara's hand tightly, raising his chin as though to declare to the world, "This is my wife. This is the woman who has outshone us all." The limousine door closed behind them, muffling the chaos outside. At last, silence. Edward exhaled heavily, the tension draining from his shoulders. Clara leaned back against the seat, her face glowing with quiet contentment. "You were magnificent tonight," Edward said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. Clara blinked, surprised. "Me, I only spoke from the heart. Anyone could have done the same." "No," Edward said firmly, shaking his head. "No one else could have. You did not just speak, you moved them. You changed the room, Clara. I watched men and women who have everything pause and listen to you as though you held something they lacked. And you do." Her lips curved into a gentle smile. "Edward, I did not do it for them. I did it because it mattered to me. Because kindness matters to me." Her words pierced him. Edward lowered his gaze, shame rising once more. He clasped her hand, his grip tightening as though afraid to lose her. "Clara, I have to confess something. Tonight, before we arrived, I was ashamed. Not of you," he added quickly, his voice breaking, "but of myself. I worried how they would see you. I worried they would mock you, that you would somehow reflect poorly on me. And now I see how blind I have been. You are everything I could have ever hoped for, and I have failed to honor that." Clara's eyes softened with understanding. She did not scold, did not pull her hand away. Instead, she lifted her free hand to his cheek, guiding his gaze back to hers. "Edward, I never needed their approval. I never needed diamonds or gowns to feel worthy of you. All I ever wanted was for you to believe in me." Edward's throat tightened. He blinked back the sting of tears, something he had not done since boyhood. "I do," he whispered hoarsely. "More than ever. Tonight, I saw what I should have seen all along, that you are not ordinary. You are remarkable. And I am the luckiest man alive." Clara leaned forward and kissed his forehead, her touch tender. Then let us never speak of shame again. We have nothing to hide from the world, Edward. Nothing at all. As the limousine carried them through the sleeping city, Edward felt a transformation within himself. The wealth, the accolades, the polished image, suddenly, they seemed small compared to the treasure he already possessed. The woman beside him, with her quiet strength and radiant heart, had not only stolen the show. She had stolen his pride and remade it into humility, into gratitude, into love deeper than he had ever known. When they reached home, Edward stepped out first and turned, extending his hand to help Clara from the car. But this time, it was not with hesitation or hidden unease. It was with pride, as though he were presenting her to the world. And perhaps, in a way, he was presenting her to himself for the very first time. The mansion was quiet when Edward and Clara returned. The servants had long since retired, leaving only the gentle crackle of a fire in the drawing room and the faint perfume of roses drifting in from the garden. Edward led Clara inside, still holding her hand as though afraid that if he let go, the magic of the evening would vanish. Clara slipped out of her modest shoes near the door and let out a soft laugh. "My feet are sore. I never thought one dance could cause so much trouble." Edward turned toward her, his face tender. "That dance made the entire evening, Clara. It was not trouble, it was triumph." She lowered her gaze shyly, but Edward would not allow her to retreat into humility this time. He gently lifted her chin so their eyes met. "Do you know what I realized tonight?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "I realized I have spent years polishing my reputation, my image, my fortune, yet, all the while, the greatest treasure I ever possessed stood beside me, unacknowledged. That ends tonight. I will never again hide my pride in you." Clara's lips trembled as though she might cry, but instead, she whispered, "Edward, I never needed you to parade me before the world. All I ever wanted was to walk beside you, not behind, not beneath, but beside." Her words struck him like a hammer to glass, shattering the last remnants of his vanity. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, fiercely, as though to make up for all the times he had failed to do so. "Then from this day forward, that is where you will always be, beside me, in every room, every battle, every triumph. My partner, my equal, my heart." For a long while, they remained like that, wrapped in silence, until Clara finally pulled back. "You speak as though something has changed in you tonight." Edward gave a small, almost rueful laugh. "Something has. For the first time, I saw you not as others might judge you, but as you truly are. And I realized how small I have been. Clara, you are the only person in that entire room who mattered tonight. You are the reason people left with light in their eyes. You showed them something they had forgotten: humanity, sincerity, grace. That cannot be bought, cannot be learned. It is who you are." Clara touched his face gently. "And yet, Edward, I am only myself. I did not set out to impress anyone. I simply spoke from my heart. If people listened, it is only because they were ready to hear." Edward shook his head, overwhelmed. "Do you know what Richard Stanton said to me? He called me fortunate. For years, I thought fortune was measured by numbers in a ledger, by the shimmer of gold and silver. But tonight, for the first time, I understood what fortune truly is. It is you, Clara. You are my fortune. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she rested her head against his chest. Then let us guard it well, she murmured. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the breakfast room. Edward had already risen early, an uncommon habit for him after late nights. He had instructed the household staff to prepare Clara's favorite tea and a small arrangement of fresh daisies at her place. When she entered, still in a simple robe, she paused in surprise. "Edward?" she asked softly. He looked up from the newspaper he had been pretending to read, his heart skipping at the sight of her. He stood at once and pulled out her chair, bowing slightly. "For the queen of last night's ball," he said warmly. Clara laughed, shaking her head. "You exaggerate." "No," Edward replied with absolute seriousness. "I do not exaggerate. If anything, I understate. Clara, I want the world to know you. I want every person who speaks my name to know yours as well. No more shadows, no more silence. From now on, you stand in the light where you belong." Clara sat, folding her hands in her lap, regarding him thoughtfully. "And if the world should laugh at us again?" Edward smiled, his eyes shining with conviction. "Then let them laugh. Their laughter is hollow. But I have seen what true worth looks like, and nothing can dim it. Not their scorn, not their envy, nothing." Over the following weeks, Edward kept his promise. He introduced Clara proudly at business luncheons, gala dinners, and charity events. But something remarkable happened. Far from ridicule, Clara was embraced. Her humility and compassion touched even the most hardened socialites. Invitations poured in, not because of Edward's wealth, but because of Clara's presence. She became a quiet beacon in a world obsessed with glitter, reminding them of the substance behind the shine. One evening, months later, Edward and Clara hosted their own gathering at the mansion. The halls rang with music, laughter, and conversation. Guests spoke openly of Clara's influence, how her speech had inspired them to give more generously, how her kindness had softened rivalries, how her sincerity had reminded them of forgotten values. Edward stood at the edge of the room, watching his wife as she moved among the guests, radiating calm and warmth. And for the first time in his life, he felt no need to compete, no hunger to prove himself. He was content, profoundly content, simply to be known as her husband. When Clara finally rejoined him, slipping her arm through his, he whispered in her ear, "Do you know what they see when they look at me now?" Clara tilted her head curiously. "What?" "They see a man blessed beyond measure because of the woman beside him." Clara smiled softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Then they see the truth." And Edward, for the first time, felt the truth settle deep in his bones. The fortune he had spent his life chasing had never been in the gilded halls, the jeweled accounts, or the accolades of men. It was here, in the gentle weight of her arm upon his, in the quiet power of her love, in the life they had built together. He was, at last, the richest man alive.